Moll Flanders by Daniel Defoe. My true name is so well known in the records at Newgate and in the Old Bailey, and there are some things of such consequence still depending there, relating to my particular conduct, that it is not to be expected I should set my name, or the account of my family, to this work. Perhaps after my death it may be better known. At present it would not be proper. No, not though a general pardon should be issued, even without exceptions and reserve of persons or crimes. It is enough to tell you that as some of my worst comrades, who were out of the way of doing me harm, having gone out of the world by the steps and the string, as I often expected to go, knew me by the name of Moll Flanders. So you may give me leave to speak of myself under that name, till I dare own who I have been, as well as who I am. I have been told that in one of our neighbour nations, whether it be in France or where else I know not, they have, on order from the king, that when any criminal is condemned either to die or to the galleys or to be transported, if they leave any children, so they are immediately taken into the care of the government. Had this been the custom in our country, I had not been left a poor desolate girl without friends, without clothes, without help or helper in the world, as was my fate. My mother was convicted of felony for a certain petty theft. Being found quick with child, she was respited for about 7 months, in which time, having brought me into the world, she obtained the favour of being transported, and left me about half a year old, and in bad hands, you may be sure. The first account that I can recollect was that I had wandered among a crew of those people they call gypsies. It was at Colchester in Essex that those people left me, and being taken up by some of the parish officers, I gave an account that I came into the town with the gypsies. I was now in a way to be provided for. Compassion moved the magistrates of the town to order some care to be taken of me, and I became one of their own. In the provision they made for me, it was my good hap to be put to nurse, as they call it, to a woman who was indeed poor, but had been in better circumstances. This woman also had a little school, which she kept to teach children to read and to work. But that which was worth all the rest, she bred them up very religiously. I was continued here till I was 8 years old, when I was terrified with news that I should go to service. I put me into a great fright, and I told my nurse that I believed I could get my living without going to service, for she had taught me to work with my needle and to spin worsted. And in short, I did nothing but work and cry all day. One day my nurse came into the room where all we poor children were at work. She sat down just over against me, and after a while she began to talk to me. "Thou foolish child," says she, "thou art always crying. What dost cry for?" "Because they will take me away," say I, "and put me to service. And I am but a little girl, and I can't do it." "What, would you be a gentlewoman?" "Yes," says I, and cried heartily. Some time after this, going to wait on the mayor, and talking of such things as belonged to her business, at last my story came up, and my good nurse told Mr. Mayor the whole tale. He was so pleased with it that he would call his lady and his 2 daughters to hear it, and it made mirth enough among them, you may be sure. And all this while, my good old nurse, Mrs. Mayoress, and all the rest of them did not understand me at all, for they meant one sort of thing by the word gentlewoman, and I meant quite another. For, alas, all I understood by being a gentlewoman was to be able to work for myself, whereas they meant to live great, rich, and high, and I know not what. I was now about 10 years old, and began to look a little womanish and very mannerly, and as I had often heard the ladies say I was pretty, and would be a very handsome woman, so you may be sure that hearing them say so made me not a little proud. By the time I was 12 years old, at last one of the ladies took so much fancy to me that she would have me home to her house for a month, she said, to be among her daughters. This was prudently managed enough, and I went to the lady's house. But I was so pleased there with the young ladies, and they so pleased with me, that I had enough to do to come away, and they were as unwilling to part with me. However, I did come away, and lived almost a year more with my honest old woman, and began now to be very helpful to her. About the time that I was 14 years and a quarter old, my good old nurse fell sick and died. I was then in a sad condition indeed, for poor good woman being buried, the parish children she kept were immediately removed by the church wardens. The school was at an end, and the children of it had no more to do but just stay at home till they were sent somewhere else. Now I was a poor gentlewoman indeed, and I was just that very night to be turned into the wide world. But it seems that some of the neighbours who had known my circumstances took so much compassion of me as to acquaint the lady in whose family I had been a week, and immediately she sent her maid to fetch me away to her home. And here I continued till I was between 17 and 18 years old, and here I had all the advantages for my education that could be imagined. Thus far I had had a smooth story to tell of myself, and in all this part of my life I not only had the reputation of living in a very good family, but I had the character, too, of a very sober, modest, and virtuous young woman. Neither had I yet any occasion to know what a temptation to wickedness meant. But that which I was too vain of was my ruin, for the lady in the house where I was had 2 sons, young gentlemen of very promising parts and of extraordinary behaviour. The eldest, a gay gentleman, began with that unhappy snare to all women, taking notice upon all occasions how pretty I was, as he called it. After he had thus baited his hook, he played an opener game, and one day, going by his sister's chamber when I was there doing something about dressing her, he comes in with an air of gaiety. "Oh, Mrs. Betty," said he to me. "How do you do, Mrs. Betty? Don't your cheeks burn, Mrs. Betty?" "What makes you talk so, brother?" says the lady. "Why," says he, "a great many fine things have been said of Mrs. Betty, and particularly that she is the handsomest young woman in Colchester." "I wonder at you, brother," says the sister. "Betty wants but one thing. If she had not money, she's nobody." Her young brother, who was by, cried out, "Hold, sister, you run too fast. I assure you, if I find a woman so accomplished, I would not trouble myself about the money." I thought it was time for me to withdraw and leave them, and I did so, but not so far but that I heard abundance of fine things said of myself, which served to prompt my vanity. Now, it happened one day that the elder brother came running upstairs towards the room where his sisters used to sit and work, and calling to them before he came in. I, being there alone, stepped to the door and said, "Sir, the ladies are not here." He was just got to the door, and clasping me in his arms, as if it had been by chance, "Oh, Mrs. Betty," says he, "are you here? That's better still. I want to speak with you more than I do with them." And then, having me in his arms, he kissed me 3 or 4 times. I struggled to get away, and yet did it but faintly neither, and he held me fast and still kissed me till he was almost out of breath, and then, sitting down, says, "Dear Betty, I am in love with you." His words, I must confess, fired my blood and put me into disorder enough. He repeated it afterwards several times, that he was in love with me, and my heart spoke as plain as a voice that I liked it. After this attack, though, it was not long but he found an opportunity to catch me again, and almost in the same posture. It was his younger sister's chamber that I was in, and as there was nobody in the house but the maids below stairs, he began to be in earnest with me indeed. Taking his advantage, he threw me down upon the bed, and kissed me there most violently, but, to give him his due, offered no manner of rudeness to me. After this he puts 5 guineas into my hand, and went away downstairs. He comes up again in half an hour, and falls to work with me again as before. only with a little less introduction. Stopping my very breath with kisses, he threw me upon the bed again. But then, being both well warmed, he went farther with me than decency permits me to mention. However, though he took these freedoms with me, it did not go to that which they call the last favour. When this was over, he stayed but a little while, but he put almost a handful of gold into my hand, and left me. It will not be strange if I now began to think, but alas, I gave up myself to a readiness of being ruined without the least concern, and am a fair memento to all young women whose vanity prevails over their virtue. Indeed, I think I rather wished for that ruin than studied to avoid it. In the meantime, however, I was cunning enough not to give the least room to any in the family to suspect me, or to imagine that I had the least correspondence with this young gentleman. But as the devil is an unwearied tempter, so he never fails to find opportunity for that wickedness he invites to. It was one evening that I was in the garden when he found means to convey a note into my hand, by which he directed me to understand that he would, tomorrow, desire me publicly to go of an errand for him into the town, and that I should see him somewhere by the way. Accordingly, after dinner the next day, he gave me my errands, and when we were together, he began to talk very gravely to me, and to tell me that he resolved to marry me as soon as he came to his estate, that in the meantime, if I would grant his request, he would maintain me very honourably. As he pressed me to speak, I told him I had no reason to question the sincerity of his love to me, but what, my dear? What if you should be with child? Is that not it? Why, then, says he, I'll take care of you. And, says he, here's an earnest for you. And with that, he pulls out a silk purse with 100 guineas in it. And I'll give you such another, says he, every year till I marry you. My colour came and went at the sight of the purse and with the fire of his proposal together, so that I could not say a word. And, putting the purse into my bosom, I made no more resistance to him, but let him do just what he pleased, and as often as he pleased. And thus I finished my own destruction at once. So we took our fill of our wicked pleasure for near half a year. And yet, which was the most to my satisfaction, I was not with child. But before this half-year was expired, his younger brother falls to work with me. And he, finding me alone in the garden one evening, begins a story of the same kind to me, and in short, he proposes, fairly and honourably, to marry me, and that before he made any other offer to me at all. I was now confounded. But here happened a circumstance which put me to my shifts, for this young gentleman, as he was plain and honest, was not so careful to make his having a kindness for Mrs. Betty a secret in the house. And at last I got information among the servants that I should, in a very little while, be desired to remove. After some time he took an opportunity to tell me that the kindness he had for me had got vent in the family, that it was true his father and mother might resent it, but that he was now in a way to live, and he did not fear maintaining me. I was now in a dreadful condition indeed, and I repented heartily my easiness with the eldest brother. Upon serious consideration, I resolved to tell the elder brother of the problem, and it was not long before I had an opportunity, and I told him I was afraid the ladies had got some secret information of our correspondence, for that it was easy to see that their conduct was very much changed towards me. He smiled when he heard all this. "Why, look you, child," says he, "that they are uneasy about you, that is true, but that they have the least suspicion of the case as it is, so far from being true that they suspect my brother, Robin. This will be to your satisfaction." "So it is," says I, "one way, but this is not the chief thing that troubles me." And I told him how imprudently his brother had managed himself, and how far I had resisted him. "But," says I, "my case will be doubly hard, for as they carry it ill to me now, because he desires to have me, they'll carry it worse when they shall find I have denied him." This discourse surprised him indeed very much. He told me then that he desired I would not give my consent to his brother, nor yet give him a flat denial. I seemed to start at his saying I should not give him any consent. I told him he knew very well I had no consent to give, that he had engaged himself to marry me. "Well, my dear," says he, "don't be concerned at that now." And he pacified me as well as he could with this, but I found he was very thoughtful. His brother did not come from London for 5 or 6 days, and it was 2 days more before he got an opportunity to talk with him. But then, getting him by himself, he began to talk very close to him about it, and the same evening got an opportunity to repeat all that discourse to me. He told him he heard strange news of him since he went, viz., that he made love to Mrs. Betty. "Well," says his brother, a little angrily, "and so I do, and what then? What has anybody to do with that?" "Nay," says his brother, "don't be angry, Robin. I don't pretend to have anything to do with it." Then he went on and told me that he replied thus: "But, brother, you know she has nothing." "'Tis no matter for that," said Robin. "I love the girl." "And so, my dear," adds he, "there is no opposing him." Yes, says I, "you shall see I can oppose him." "Well, but, my dear," says he, "what can you say to him? All the house will wonder what the meaning of it should be." "Why," says I, smiling, "I can stop all their mouths at one clap by telling him, and them too, that I am married already, to his elder brother." He smiled a little, too, at this word, but I could see it startled him. However, he returned, "My dear," says he, "I have been considering very much upon it, and though it is a piece of advice that has a great many mortifications in it to me, yet, all things considered, I see no better way for you than, in earnest, to marry him." I gave him a look full of horror at those words, and turning pale as death, was at the very point of sinking down out of the chair I sat in. When I was fully recovered, I began speaking angrily. "Is this your faith and honour, your love, and the solidity of your promises?" "My dear, I have not broken one promise with you yet. I did tell you I would marry you when I was come to my estate. But you see, my father is a hale, healthy man, and may live these 30 years. And you never proposed my marrying you sooner, because you know it might be my ruin." I could not deny a word of this. "But," says I, "will you allow no affection, no love on my side?" "No, sir, depend upon it, 'tis impossible. I'd much rather be your whore than your brother's wife." And at last I asked him warmly what opinion he must have of my modesty, that he could suppose I should so much as entertain a thought of lying with 2 brothers. He was sensibly moved with this, letting me plainly see that he would be making it a point of honour not to lie with the woman that, for aught he knew, might come to be his brother's wife. The bare loss of him as a gallant was not so much my affliction as the loss of his person, whom indeed I loved to distraction. These things oppressed my mind so much that, in short, the agonies of my mind threw me into a high fever. It was near 5 weeks that I kept my bed. After the end of 5 weeks I grew better, but was so weak that the physicians gave it as their opinion that my mind was oppressed, and, in short, that I was in love. Upon this the whole house was set upon me to examine me, but I denied my being in love at all. However, they had around this time a squabble one day about me at table. "Alas," says the old lady, "that poor girl, I'm afraid she will never be well." "Well," says the elder brother, "how should Mrs. Betty be well? They say she is in love." "I would she was in love with me," says Robin. "I'd quickly put her out of her pain." "What do you mean by that, son?" says the old lady. "How can you talk so?" "Why, madam," says Robin again, very honestly, "do you think I'd let the poor girl die for love? And of one that is near at hand to be had, too." "Well," says the mother, "if you are in earnest, you are undone." "I am afraid not," says he, for I am really afraid she won't have me. Mrs. Betty's no fool. But Mrs. Betty may be engaged some other way, and what then? Nay, says the eldest sister, we can say nothing to that. Who must it be to, then? Thus the discourse ended, but it left the elder brother quite confounded. At last he was so perplexed that he was quite desperate, and resolved he would come into my chamber and see me. He related the whole story to me, of the discourse his brother had about me. I assured him I had never opened my mouth, either to his brother or to anybody else. I told that my love to him, and his offering to have me forget that affection and remove it to another, had thrown me down. But he should never be able to say that I, who he had persuaded to call myself his wife, was not as faithful to him as a wife ought to be. He shook his head and said, "Then I am ruined." It was not many weeks after this before I was about the house again, and began to grow well. But I continued melancholy, which amazed the whole family, and I expected every day to be dismissed, ruined, and abandoned. At last I broke the way myself in the family for my removing, for, being talking seriously with the old lady one day about my own circumstances in the world, the old lady said, "I am afraid, Betty, what I have said to you about my son has had some influence upon you. Pray, will you let me know how the matter stands with you both?" "Why, truly, madam," said I, "that matter stands as I wish it did not. Mr. Robin has several times proposed marriage to me." Away goes the old lady, who was resolved to talk with her son immediately. "Sit down, Robin," says she. "I must have some talk with you. I hope it is about a good wife, for I am at a great loss in that affair." "How can that be?" says his mother. "Did you not say you resolved to have Mrs. Betty?" "Ay, madam," says Robin, "but I am not able to come up to her terms." "Well, but, son," says the old lady, "if you are disposed to let us into the mystery of it, what were these hard conditions?" "The conditions are," says Robin, "that I bring my father and you to consent to it. You must determine for me. Betty or nobody is the word, and the question, which of the two, shall be in your breast to decide, madam." All this was dreadful to me, for the mother began to yield, and Robin pressed her home in it. On the other hand, she advised with the eldest son, and he used all the arguments in the world to persuade her to consent. And the mother, which was just as he wished, proposed it to him to talk with Mrs. Betty. He came again to me then, and took me in his arms, and kissed me very tenderly, but told me he had a long discourse to hold with me, and it was now come to that crisis that I should make myself happy or miserable as long as I lived. "Now, dear child," says he, "consider what it will be to marry a gentleman of a good family, in good circumstances, and with the consent of the whole house." And he went on with me thus: "What has happened between us, child, so long as we both agree to do so, may be buried and forgotten. I here offer you £500 in money, to make you some amends for the freedoms I have taken with you, which we shall look upon as some of the follies of our lives, which 'tis hoped we may repent of." He spoke thus above an hour and a half in that discourse, so he answered all my objections, and his persuasion at length prevailed with me to consent, though with much reluctance. Then he cajoled with his brother, and persuaded him what service he had done him, but thus diligently did he cheat him, and had the thanks of a faithful friend for shifting off his whore into his brother's arms for a wife. Modesty forbids me to reveal the secrets of the marriage bed, but nothing could have happened more suitable to my circumstances than that my husband was so fuddled when he came to bed that he could not remember in the morning whether he had had any conversation with me or no, and I was obliged to tell him he had. It concerns the story in hand very little to enter into the farther particulars of the family, or of myself, for the 5 years that I lived with this husband, only to observe that I had 2 children by him, and that at the end of 5 years he died, and we lived very agreeably together. But as he had not received much from the family, and had, in the little time he lived, acquired no great matters, so my circumstances were not great, and I was left a widow with about £1,200 in my pocket. My 2 children were indeed taken happily off my hands by my husband's father and mother. I was now left loose to the world, and being still young and handsome, as everybody said of me, and I assure you I thought myself so, and with a tolerable fortune in my pocket, I put no small value upon myself, and I was resolved now to be married or nothing, and to be well married or not at all. And at last I found a gentleman tradesman, indeed a draper. But I found that I had sold myself to a tradesman that was a rake, gentleman, shopkeeper, and beggar altogether. And 'tis enough to tell you that in about 2 years and a quarter he broke, being arrested in an action too heavy for him to give bail to. So he sent for me to come to him. It was no surprise to me, but when he sent for me, he behaved much better than I expected. And he told me plainly he had played the fool, and therefore he would have me go home, and in the night take away everything I had in the house of value. So I did as he bade me, and thus, having taken my leave of him, I never saw him more. However, even with all this, and all that I had secured before, I found, upon casting things up, my fortune much lessened. Upon this apprehension, the first thing I did was to go quite out of my knowledge, and go by another name. This I did effectually, for I went into the Mint too, took lodgings in a very private place, dressed me up in the habit of a widow, and called myself Mrs. Flanders. Here I concealed myself, and though my new acquaintances knew nothing of me, yet I soon got a great deal of company about me. However, I kept myself safe yet, though I began, like my Lord Rochester's mistress, that loved his company, but would not admit him farther, to have the scandal of a whore without the joy. And upon this score, tired with the place, and indeed with the company too, I began to consider very seriously what I had to do. I knew I had no friends, no, not one friend or relation in the world, and I saw nothing but misery, and starving was before me, and filled with horror at the place I was in, I resolved to be gone. Now, I had made an acquaintance with a very sober, good sort of a woman, who was a widow, too, like me, but in better circumstances. Her husband had been a captain of a merchant ship, and having had the misfortune to be cast away, his widow, being pursued by the creditors, was forced to take shelter in the Mint. She soon made things up, with the help of friends, though, and was at liberty again, and she invited me to go home with her. I accepted her offer, and was with her half a year, and should have been longer, but in that interval what she proposed to me happened to herself, and she married. But whose fortune soever was upon the increase, mine seemed to be upon the wane, and I soon learned by experience that for a wife the money was the thing. It soon began to be found that the widow had no fortune, and I began to be dropped in all the discourses of matrimony. Being well-bred, handsome, witty, modest, and agreeable, all of which I had allowed to my character, whether justly or no, is not to the purpose. I resolved, therefore, as to the state of my present circumstances, that it was absolutely necessary to change my station, and even to pass by another name, if I found occasion. I communicated my thoughts to my intimate friend, the captain's lady, and my dear and faithful friend frequently made me presents, as money came into her hands, such as fully amounted to a maintenance. And at last she made this unhappy proposal to me, that as we had observed how men made no scruple to set themselves out as persons meriting a woman of fortune, when they had really no fortune of their own, it was but just to deal with them in their own way, and, if it was possible, to deceive the deceiver. The captain's lady, in short, put this project into my head, and told me if I would be ruled by her, I should certainly get a husband of fortune. The first step she put me upon was to call her cousin, and to go to a relation's house of hers in the country, where she directed me, and where she brought her husband to visit me. And calling me cousin, she invited me most passionately to come to town and be with them. In the next place, she tells her husband that I had at least £1,500 fortune, and that I was like to have a great deal more. It was enough to tell her husband this, for it presently went all over the neighbourhood that the young widow at the captain's was of fortune. I picked out my man without much difficulty by the judgment I made of his way of courting me. This was my man, but I was to try him to the bottom, for if he balked, I knew I was undone. First, therefore, I pretended on all occasions to doubt his sincerity. One morning he pulls off his diamond ring and writes upon the glass of the sash in my chamber this line: "You I love, and you alone." I read it, and asked him to lend me his ring, with which I wrote under it thus: "And so in love says everyone." He takes his ring again, and writes another line thus: "Virtue alone is an estate." I borrowed it again, and I wrote under it: "But money's virtue, gold is fate." He coloured as red as fire to see me turn so quick upon him, and in a kind of rage told me he would conquer me, and writes again thus: "I scorn your gold, and yet I love." I ventured all upon the next cast of poetry, as you'll see, for I wrote boldly under his last: "I'm poor. Let's see how kind you'll prove." Here he flew to me, took me in his arms, and kissing me very eagerly, and with the greatest passion imaginable, he held me fast, till he called for a pen and ink. And then he told me he could not wait the tedious writing on the glass, but pulling out a piece of paper, he began and wrote again: "Be mine with all your poverty." I took his pen and followed him immediately thus: "Yet secretly you hope I lie." He told me that was unkind, and he writes again: "Let love alone be our debate." I wrote again: "She loves enough that does not hate." This he took for a favour, and so laid down the cudgels, that is to say, the pen. I then took the freedom one day, after we had talked pretty close to the subject, to tell him that it was true I had received the compliment of a lover from him, namely, that he would take me without inquiring into my fortune, and I would make him a suitable return in this, viz., that I would make as little inquiry into his as consisted with reason, but I hoped he would allow me to ask a few questions. He began from this discourse to let me voluntarily into all his affairs, and to tell me in a frank, open way all his circumstances, by which I found he was very well to pass in the world, but that great part of his estate consisted of 3 plantations which he had in Virginia. I jested with him extremely about the figure he would make in Virginia. I told him I had not a fortune suitable to a gentleman of £1,200 a year, as he said his estate would be. He replied generously that he would never desire me to go to Virginia with him, or go thither himself without me, unless I was perfectly willing. All this, you may be sure, was as I wished, and indeed nothing could have happened more perfectly agreeable. And, in short, we were married, and very happily married on my side, I assure you, for he was the best-humoured man that ever woman had. When we were married, I was shrewdly put to it to bring him that little stock I had, and to let him see it was no more. But there was a necessity for it, so I took my opportunity one day when we were alone. "My dear," said I have a great difficulty upon me, which I scarce know how to manage." "What's that, my dear?" says he. "Why," says I, "'tis a little hard upon me, and 'tis harder upon you. I am told that the captain has told you I had a great deal more money than I ever pretended to have. Well, says he, the captain may have told me so, but what then, if you never told me what you had? So I have no reason to blame you if you have nothing at all. That is so just, said I, and so generous, that it makes my having but a little a double affliction to me. The less you have, my dear, says he, the worse for us both. But I hope your affliction you speak of is not caused for fear I should be unkind to you. Well, said I, my dear, I am glad I have not been concerned in deceiving you before marriage. If I deceive you since, 'tis never the worse. That I am poor is too true, but not so poor as to have nothing, neither. So I pulled out some bank bills and gave him about £160. There's something, my dear, says I, and not quite all, neither. I had brought him so near to expecting nothing by what I had said before, that the money, though the sum was small in itself, was doubly welcome to him. I let him please himself with that £160 2 or 3 days, and then, having been abroad that day, and as if I had been to fetch it, I brought him £100 more home in gold, and told him there was a little more portion for him. And in short, in about a week more, I brought him £180 more, and about £60 in linen. And now, my dear, says I to him, I'm very sorry to tell you that there is all. And he was so obliged by the manner, and so pleased with the sum, for he had been in a terrible fright lest it had been nothing at all, that he accepted it very thankfully. My husband, to give him his due, was a man of infinite good nature, but he was no fool, and finding his income not suited to the manner of living which he had intended, he discovered many times his inclination of going over to Virginia to live upon his own. I began presently to understand his meaning, and told him that I was sensible he had been disappointed in a wife, and that finding his expectations not answered that way, I could do no less to make him amends than tell him that I was very willing to go over to Virginia with him and live there. To make this part of the story short, we put on board the ship which we went in a large quantity of good furniture for our house, with stores of linen and other necessaries, and a good cargo for sale, and away we went. To give an account of the manner of our voyage, which was long and full of dangers, is out of my way. All that I can say is that after a terrible passage, we arrived in York River in Virginia, and coming to our plantation, we were received with all the demonstrations of tenderness and affection by my husband's mother that were possible to be expressed. We lived here altogether, my mother-in-law, at my entreaty, continuing in the house. My husband likewise continued that same as at first, and I thought myself the happiest creature alive, when an odd and surprising event put an end to all that felicity in a moment, and rendered my condition the most uncomfortable, if not the most miserable, in the world. My mother-in-law was a mighty cheerful, good-humoured old woman, and used to entertain me in particular with abundance of stories. Among the rest, she often told me how the greatest part of the inhabitants of the colony came thither in very indifferent circumstances from England. That, generally speaking, they were of two sorts, either, one, such as were brought over by masters of ships to be sold as servants or slaves, or, two, such as are transported from Newgate and other prisons. When they come here, says she, we make no difference. And with a great deal of good-humoured confidence, she told me she was one of the second sort of inhabitants herself. And here's the mark of it, child, says she, pulling off her glove. Looky here, says she, turning up the palm of her hand, and she showed me a very fine white arm and hand, but branded in the inside of the hand. We had frequent discourses of this kind, and I began, in an intimate kind of way, to ask her to tell me something of her own story. But coming to one particular that required telling her name, I thought I should have sunk down in the place, for let anyone judge what must be the anguish of my mind when I came to reflect that this was certainly no more or less than my own mother. And I had now had 2 children, and was big with another by my own brother, and lay with him still, every night. I leave it to any man to judge what difficulties presented to my view. If I had discovered myself to my mother then, it might be difficult to convince her of the particulars, and I had no way to prove them. On the other hand, if she had questioned or doubted me, I had been undone, for the bare suggestion would have immediately separated me from my husband. In the meantime, then, as I was but too sure of the fact, I lived, therefore, in open, avowed incest and whoredom, and all under the appearance of an honest wife. However, upon the most sedate consideration, I resolved that it was absolutely necessary to conceal it all, and thus I lived, with the greatest pressure imaginable, for 3 years more. During this time, I know not by what ill fate guided, but everything went wrong with us afterwards, and we came at last to be in such ill terms with one another that I claimed a promise of my husband, which he entered into willingly with me, that I should come away to England again. But at last I put him so out of humour that he took up a rash and fatal resolution, in short, that I should not go to England, and though he had promised me, yet it was an unreasonable thing for me to desire it. Yet I looked upon him no longer as a husband, but as a near relation, and I resolved somehow or other to be clear of him. At last I refused to bed with him, and carrying on the breach upon all occasions to extremity, he told me once he thought I was mad. This brought me to a resolution, whatever came of it, to lay open my whole case. But in the meantime another quarrel with my husband happened, and in the end brought out the whole story. He began with a calm expostulation upon my being so resolute to go to England. I defended it, and one hard word bringing on many, he told me I did not treat him as if he were my husband, that he was very loath to use violence with me, but that, in short, he saw a necessity of it now, and that for the future he should be obliged to take such measures as should reduce me to my duty. My blood was now fired to the utmost. I told him for his fair means and his foul, they were equally condemned by me, that for my going to England I was resolved on it. But for his farther consideration, I thought fit to tell him thus much, that he neither was my lawful husband, nor they lawful children, and that I had reason to regard neither of them more than I did. At length he tells all this story to his mother, and sets her upon me to get the main secret out of me, and she used her utmost skill with me indeed. But I put her to a full stop by telling her that the reason and mystery of the whole matter lay in herself. She was struck dumb at this suggestion, and at last I told her I dared trust her with a secret of the greatest importance if she would engage solemnly not to acquaint her son with it without my consent. She was long in promising this part, but rather than not come at the main secret, she agreed that too, and I began the whole story. It is impossible to express the astonishment she was in. She was not inclined to believe the story, or to remember the particulars, for she immediately foresaw the confusions that must follow. But everything concurred so exactly with the story she had told me of herself that she had stopped her own mouth. "Unhappy child," says she, "what miserable chance could bring thee hither? And in the arms of my own son, too! Why, we are all undone!" It was not long, you may be sure, before we had a second conference upon the same subject. Now we fell into a close debate about what should be first done, before we gave an account of the matter to my husband. My mother's opinion was that I should bury the whole thing and continue to live with him as my husband. This proposal did not agree at all with my judgment of the thing, for my thoughts ran quite another way, and I asked her how she could think I could bear the thoughts of lying with my own brother. I had, on the most serious reflections, come to this resolution, which I hoped she would like, that she should use her endeavours with her son to give me leave to go for England, as I had desired, and to furnish me with a sufficient sum of money, that he might one time or other think it proper to come over to me. That when I was gone, she should then, in cold blood, discover the case to him. In this directly opposite opinion to one another, my mother and I continued a long time, and it was impossible to reconcile our judgments. At last I resolved on a desperate course, and told my mother my resolution, that, in short, I would tell him of it. All this while he lay at my mother to find out, if possible, what was the meaning of that dreadful expression of mine, as he called it. My mother put him off, told him of his terrifying and affrighting me with his threats of sending me to a madhouse and the like, and advised him not to make a woman desperate. His conduct was then immediately altered, and he was quite another man to me. He had continued his altered carriage to me near a month, when one evening, as we were sitting and talking very friendly, I fetched a deep sigh, and told him there was nobody in the world could be more delighted than I was in the good agreement we had kept up. But I was sorry to tell him that there was an unhappy circumstance in our case, but to keep him in the dark about it was the kindest thing I could do. It is impossible to express his surprise at this relation, and he told me I could not be called kind if I concealed it from him. "But come, my dear," said I, "what conditions will you make with me upon the opening this affair to you?" "Any conditions in the world," said he. "Well," said I, "come, give it me under your hand, that if you do not find I am in any fault, you will not blame me." "That," says he, "is the most reasonable demand in the world. Give me a pen and ink." And he wrote the condition. "Why," says I, "the next is that you will not blame me for not discovering the secret of it to you before I knew it." "Very just again," says he. So he wrote down that also, and signed it. "Well, my dear," says I, "then I have but one condition more to make with you, and that is, that as there is nobody concerned in it but you and I, you shall not discover it to any person in the world, except your own mother, and that in all the measures you shall take upon the discovery, as I am equally concerned in it with you, though as innocent as yourself, you shall do nothing in a passion." This a little amazed him, but he wrote down the words distinctly, and at last he signed it. "Well," says I, "my dear, I'll ask you no more under your hand, but I beg you to promise me you will receive this thing with composure." "I'll do my utmost," says he. "Well then," says I, "it is this. As I told you before in a heat that I was not your lawful wife, and that our children were not legal children, so I must let you know now, in calmness and in kindness, that I am your own sister, and you my own brother, and that we are both the children of our mother, now alive, and in the house, who is convinced of the truth of it." I saw him turn pale and look wild, and I said, "Now, remember your promise, and receive it with presence of mind." However, I called a servant and got him a little glass of rum, for he was just fainting away. When he was a little recovered, I said to him, "This story, you may be sure, requires a long explanation, and therefore have patience and compose your mind, and I'll make it as short as I can." And with this I told him what I thought was needful of the fact. "'Tis a dreadful surprise to me," says he at length, and he looked a little disordered when he said this, "but he at last was prevailed with, and I obtained a very good cargo for my coming to England. When I parted with my brother, for such I am now to call him, we agreed that after I arrived he should pretend to have an account that I was dead in England, and so might marry again when he would. He promised and engaged me to correspond with me as a sister, and to assist and support me as long as I lived, and that if he died before me, he would leave sufficient to his mother to take care of me still. I came away for England in the month of August, after I had been 8 years in that country, and now a new scene of misfortunes attended me, which perhaps few women have gone through the like of. We had an indifferent good voyage, and we got at last into Milford Haven in Wales, and I got to London in about 3 weeks, where I heard, a little while after, that the ship was arrived in Bristol, but by the violent weather she had been in, and the breaking of her mainmast, she had great damage on board, and a great part of her cargo was spoiled. I had now a new scene of life upon my hands, and a dreadful appearance it had. What I brought with me was indeed considerable, had it come safe, and by the help of it I might have married again tolerably well. But as it was, I was reduced to between 200 or 300 pounds. I was entirely without friends, nay, even so much as without acquaintance. And as for my subtle friend that set me up formerly for a fortune, she was dead, and her husband also, as I was informed upon sending a person unknown to inquire. The looking after my cargo of goods soon after obliged me to take a journey to Bristol, and during my attendance upon that affair I took the diversion of going to the bath. For as I was still far from being old, so my humour, which was always gay, continued so to an extreme, and being now, as it were, a woman of fortune, though I was a woman without a fortune, I expected something or other might happen in my way that might mend my circumstances, as had been my case before. The Bath is a place of gallantry, and here I stayed the whole latter season. Here also I contracted an acquaintance with a woman in whose house I lodged, who, though she did not keep an ill house, as we call it, yet had none of the best principles in herself. I had, on all occasions, behaved myself so well as not to get the least slur upon my reputation on any account whatever, and all the men that I had conversed with were of so good reputation that I had not gotten the least reflection by conversing with them. I had many melancholy hours at the Bath, however, after all the season was gone. For though I went to Bristol sometimes for the disposing of my effects and for recruits of money, yet I chose to come back to Bath for my residence, because, being on good terms with the woman in whose house I lodged in the summer, I found that during the winter I lived rather cheaper there than I could do anywhere else. But having contracted a nearer intimacy with the said woman, I could not avoid communicating to her something of the narrowness of my circumstances, and the great loss I had received, which indeed came to almost £500. So I did not fail to let my new friend know that I expected a supply from Virginia, and so indeed I did. My new friend appeared sensibly affected with my condition, and indeed was so very kind as to reduce the rate of my living with her to so low a price during the winter that she convinced me she got nothing by me. When the spring season came on, she continued to be as kind to me as she could, and I lodged with her for a time. Now, she had some persons of character that frequently lodged in her house, and, in particular, the gentleman who singled me out for his companion the winter before. In a word, this gentleman came down and continued to single me out for his peculiar confidence. He was a complete gentleman, that must be confessed, and his company was very agreeable to me, as mine, if I might believe him, was to him. And he soon understood from me that I was a widow, that I had arrived at Bristol from Virginia by the last ships. I understood by him, and by others of him, that he had a wife, but that the lady was distempered in her head. My landlady, who of her own accord encouraged the correspondence on all occasions, gave me an advantageous character of him as a man of honour and of virtue, as well as of a great estate. And indeed he had frequently come into my chamber, even when I was in bed, and I also into his when he was in bed. Yet he never offered anything to me farther than a kiss. I frequently took notice to my landlady of his exceeding modesty, and she again used to tell me she believed it was so from the beginning. However, she used to tell me that she thought I ought to expect some gratification from him for my company. I told her I had not given him the least occasion to think I wanted it, or that I would accept of it from him. She told me she would take that part upon her, and she did so, and managed it so dexterously that the first time we were together alone, after she had talked with him, he began to inquire a little into my circumstances. I stood off very boldly. I told him that though my cargo of tobacco was damaged, I hoped with frugal management I should make it hold out till more would come. Some weeks passed after this, and still I never asked him for money. When my landlady, a cunning creature, makes a story of her own inventing, and comes in bluntly to me when we were together, "Oh, widow," says she, "I have bad news to tell you this morning." "What is it?" said I. "Are the Virginia ships taken by the French?" For that was my fear. "No, no," says she, "but the man you sent to Bristol yesterday for money is come back and says he has brought none." Now, I could by no means like her project. I thought it looked too much like prompting. "I can't imagine why he should say so to you," said I, "for I assure you he brought all the money I sent him for, and here it is," said I, pulling out my purse with about 12 guineas in it. My gentleman seemed distasted a little at her talking to me as she did at first, as well as I. But when he saw me give such an answer, he came immediately to himself again. The next morning we talked of it again, when I found he was fully satisfied, and, smiling, said he hoped I would not want money, and not tell him of it. I told him I had been very much dissatisfied at my landlady's talking so publicly the day before of what she had nothing to do with, but I supposed she wanted what I owed her, which was about 8 guineas. He was in a mighty good humour when he heard me say I had paid her, and it went off into some other discourse at that time. But the next morning, he having heard me up about my room before him, he called to me, and I, answering, he asked me to come into his chamber. He was in bed when I came in, and he made me come and sit down on his bedside. After some very kind expressions, he asked me if I would be very honest to him and give a sincere answer to one thing he would desire of me. His request was to let him see my purse. I immediately put my hand into my pocket and, laughing at him, pulled it out, and there was in it 3 guineas and a half. Then he asked me if there was all the money I had. I told him no, laughing again, not by a great deal. Well, then, he said, he would have me promise to go and fetch him all the money I had, every farthing. And I went into my chamber and fetched him a little private drawer where I had about 6 guineas more and some silver, and threw it all down upon the bed. He looked at it a little and huddled it all into the drawer again, and reaching his pocket pulled out a key, and then bade me open a little walnut-tree box he had upon the table and bring him such a drawer, which I did. In which drawer there was a great deal of money in gold, I believe near 200 guineas. And taking my hand, he made me put it in and take a whole handful and put them into my lap, and bade me get gone and carry it all home into my own chamber. It was not long after this but he began every day to find fault with my clothes, and, in a word, pressed me to buy better, which, by the way, I was willing enough to do, for I loved nothing in the world better than fine clothes. After this he made me take a maid and keep house, and his friend that came with him to Bath being gone, he obliged me to feed him, which I did very willingly. We had lived thus near 3 months, when, the company beginning to wear away at the Bath, he talked of going away, and fain he would have me go to London with him. And now he made deep protestations of a sincere, inviolable affection for me, but all along attested it to be with the utmost reserve for my virtue and his own. Indeed, he carried it that length that he protested to me that if he was naked in bed with me, he would as sacredly preserve my virtue. I believed him, and told him I did so. But this did not satisfy him. He would, he said, wait for some opportunity to give me an undoubted testimony of it. It was a great while after this that I had occasion, on my own business, to go to Bristol, upon which he hired me a coach and would go with me, and did so. And now, indeed, our intimacy increased. From Bristol he carried me to Gloucester, which was merely a journey of pleasure to take the air. And here it was our hap to have no lodgings in the inn, but one large chamber with 2 beds in it. The master of the house, going up with us to show his rooms, pulled a great curtain, which drew quite across the room and effectually divided the beds. When we came to go to bed, he decently went out of the room till I was in bed, and then went to bed in the bed on his own side of the room, but lay there talking. At last, repeating his usual saying, that he could lie naked in the bed with me and not offer me the least injury, he starts out of his bed. "And now, my dear," says he, "you shall see how I can keep my word." I resisted a little, but I must confess I should not have resisted him much if he had not made those promises at all. So I lay still and let him come to bed. When he was there, he took me in his arms, and so I lay all night with him. But he left me as innocent for him as I was the day I was born. This was a surprising thing to me, and perhaps may be so to others who know how the laws of nature work. For he was a strong, vigorous, brisk person. Nor did he act thus on a principle of religion at all, but of mere affection. It was, to me, perfectly amazing. We travelled the rest of the journey as we did before, and came back to the bath, where I frequently lay with him. And although all the familiarities between man and wife were common to us, yet he never once offered to go any farther. And I do not say that I was so wholly pleased, for I own I was much wickeder than he. Had we continued thus, I confess we had had much to boast of. But, as wise men say, it is ill venturing too near the brink of a command. It was one night that we were in bed together, warm and merry, and having drunk, I think, a little more wine that night, both of us, than usual, though not in the least to disorder either of us, when, after some follies, which I cannot name, and being clasped close in his arms, I told him that I could find it in my heart to discharge him of his engagement, for one night, and no more. He took me at my word immediately, and after that there was no resisting him. Neither, indeed, had I any mind to resist him any more. Thus the government of our virtue was broken, and I exchanged the place of friend for that unmusical, harsh-sounding title of whore. It was but a dull kind of conversation that we had together for all the rest of that week, and every now and then started that melancholy objection, what if I should be with child now? He encouraged me by telling me that as long as I was true to him, he would be so to me. At length, as I had feared, I was indeed with child. And a charming boy-child it was. And when he heard of it, he wrote me a very kind, obliging letter about it, and then told me he thought it would look better for me to come away for London. He met me at Reading in his own chariot, and so he brought me to my new lodgings at Hammersmith, which were very handsome rooms. And now I was indeed in the height of what I might call my prosperity, and I wanted nothing but to be a wife, which, however, could not be. It is true that he had no wife. That is to say, she was as no wife to him. But the just reflections of conscience oftentimes snatch a man from the arms of a mistress, as it did him at last. On the other hand, though I was not without secret reproaches of my own conscience for the life I led, yet I had the terrible prospect of poverty and starving, which lay on me as a frightful spectre. But as poverty brought me into it, so fear of poverty kept me in it. I lived 6 years in this happy but unhappy condition, in which time I brought him 3 children, but only the first of them lived. And though I removed twice in those 6 years, yet I came back the 6th year to my first lodgings at Hammersmith. Here it was that I was one morning surprised with a kind but melancholy letter from my gentleman, intimating that he was very ill, and it would not be practicable to have me with him. I was very much concerned at this account, and was very impatient to know how it was with him. I waited a fortnight or thereabouts, and heard nothing, and I began to be very uneasy indeed. And then I found that he was at his house in Bloomsbury. Here I also soon understood that he was at the last extremity, which made me almost at the last extremity too. One night I had the curiosity to disguise myself like a servant-maid, and went to the door, and speaking with one of the maids, I held a long gossip's tale with her, and had all the particulars of his illness, which I found was a pleurisy, attended with a cough and a fever. She told me the doctors said they did not expect that he could live over the next night. This was heavy news for me, and I began now to see an end to my prosperity. It lay very heavy upon my mind, too, that I had a son, a fine, lovely boy, about 5 years old, and no provision made for it. And with a sad heart I went home. You may be sure I could not rest without inquiring again, very quickly, what was become of him. And not venturing to go myself, I sent several sham messengers, till, after a fortnight's waiting longer, I found that there was hopes of his life, and in some time after I learned that he was abroad again. I made no doubt then but that I should soon hear of him. But with much surprise and amazement I waited near 2 months, and heard nothing, but that, being recovered, he was gone into the country. After this it was yet 2 months more, and then I understood he was coming to his city house again, but still I heard nothing. I had written several letters for him before, and I wrote again, in a more pressing manner than ever. This letter forced an answer from him, by which, though I found I was to be abandoned, yet I found he had sent a letter to me some time before, desiring me to go down to the Bath again. He perceived by my last letter, and by all the rest, which he went for after, that I was not gone to the Bath, upon which he writes me this following: Madam, I am surprised that my letter, dated the 8th of last month, did not come to your hand. I give you my word it was delivered at your lodgings, and to the hands of your maid. I need not acquaint you with what has been my condition for some time past, and how, having been at the edge of the grave, I am, by the unexpected and undeserved mercy of heaven, restored again. I wish you would think of going back to the Bath. I enclose you here a bill for £50 for clearing yourself at your lodgings and carrying you down. I can see you no more. I will take due care of the child. Leave him where he is, or take him with you as you please. I am, etc. I was struck with his letter as with 1,000 wounds, for I was not blind to my own crime, and I reflected that I might with less offence have continued with my brother and lived with him as a wife. But I never once reflected that I was all this while a married woman, a wife to the linen-draper, who had no power to give me a legal liberty to marry again, so that I had been no less than a whore and an adulteress all this while. I continued very pensive and sad for near a month, and did not go down to the Bath, having no inclination to be with the woman who I was with before, lest, as I thought, she should prompt me to some wicked course of life again. And now I was greatly perplexed about my little boy. It was death to me to part with the child, and yet when I considered the danger of being one time or other left with him to keep without a maintenance to support him, I then resolved to leave him where he was. I sent my gentleman a short letter, therefore, that I had obeyed his orders in all things but that of going back to the Bath. Then I represented my own circumstances to him in the most moving terms that I was able, and I begged he would put me in a posture to go back to my mother in Virginia. And he sent me a bill for £50, by a person who brought with him a general release for me to sign, and which I frankly signed. I was now a single person again. I was loosened from all the obligations either of wedlock or mistressship in the world, except my husband, the linen-draper, who, I having not now heard from in almost 15 years, nobody could blame for thinking myself entirely freed from. I now began to cast up my accounts. I had, by many letters and much importunity, and with the intercession of my mother too, had a second return of some goods from my brother, as I now call him, in Virginia, and this too was upon the condition of my sealing a general release to him. However, I managed so well in this case that I got my goods away before the release was signed. With this stock I had the world to begin again, and at length a new scene opened. There was, in the house where I lodged, a north country woman that went for a gentlewoman, and nothing was more frequent in her discourse than her account of the easy way of living in her county, till at last I told her she almost tempted me, for London was an expensive and extravagant place. I should have observed that she was always made to believe, as everybody else was, that I was a great fortune. And she said she had a sister lived near Liverpool, that her brother was a considerable gentleman there, and had a great estate also in Ireland, that she would go down there in about 2 months, and if I would give her my company thither, I should be as welcome as herself for a month or more.